The carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when Duke Alexander Whitmore heard the whispers again. They followed him everywhere lately, slipping through half-open doors and drifting across dinner tables, always the same question wrapped in different words. Does she love him, or does she love his fortune? Alexander stood at the window of his study, watching the last light fade over the hills of his estate. In 3 weeks he would marry Lady Eleanor Ashford, a woman praised across the region for her beauty and her gentle manner. Their engagement had been arranged by their families, a union that made perfect sense on paper. Her family needed money. His family needed an alliance. Nobody had ever asked whether the two of them wanted the same future. He did not know Eleanor well. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times, always with parents nearby, always with careful words chosen to impress rather than reveal. He remembered her smile, warm and quick, and the way she asked thoughtful questions about his work managing the estate. But he also remembered the servants talking in the kitchen when they thought no one important could hear them. They say the Ashford family owes money to half the county, one maid had murmured to another while polishing silver near the drawing room. No wonder the young lady agreed to marry a duke twice her interest in dancing. Alexander had walked past pretending not to hear, but the words had settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples that would not stop. He did not blame Eleanor for her family's troubles. He understood that a young woman in her position had little choice in matters of marriage. What troubled him was not knowing her heart. Would she stand beside him because she respected him, or because his title offered her family a way out of ruin? Would she still smile at him the same way if he lost every coin and every acre tomorrow? He turned from the window and found his oldest friend and steward, Edmund Carter, standing in the doorway with a stack of papers under his arm. "You look troubled, Your Grace," Edmund said, setting the papers on the desk. "Wedding preparations weighing on you." "Something like that." Alexander rubbed his temple. "Edmund, I need your honest opinion. Do you believe Lady Eleanor cares for me, or does she care for what I can give her family?" Edmund considered the question carefully before answering, as he always did. He had served the Whitmore family since Alexander was a boy learning to ride his first horse, and his loyalty had earned him the right to speak plainly. "I believe you already suspect the answer troubles you," Edmund said. "Otherwise you would not be asking." Alexander sat down heavily in his chair. "I cannot marry a woman who sees me only as a solution to her family's debts. I need to know her character before I speak my vows. I need to see how she treats people when she believes no one of consequence is watching." Edmund raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose to arrange that, Your Grace?" "You cannot exactly follow her around unseen." A slow idea began forming in Alexander's mind, the kind of idea that seemed foolish at first and grew more reasonable the longer he turned it over. He stood and walked to the window again, staring out at the gardens below, where the old gardener had recently retired and left his position empty. "What if I were not seen at all?" Alexander said quietly. "What if the Duke disappeared for a few weeks and a simple gardener took his place?" Edmund's expression shifted from confusion to concern within seconds. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life." Alexander turned back to face him, energy building behind his eyes now that the plan had taken shape. "Eleanor is staying here at the estate for the next month to help plan the wedding with my mother. If I disguise myself as a new groundskeeper, she will have no reason to suspect anything. I could observe her honestly, without the performance that comes with knowing someone important is watching." "Your mother will know something is wrong the moment you vanish from dinner," Edmund pointed out. "Then we tell her I have traveled to the northern property to inspect the timber accounts. It happens often enough that no one will question it." Alexander's mind was already racing ahead, building the pieces of a plan that felt both reckless and necessary. "You will announce that a new gardener named Tom has been hired to replace old Mr. Baxter. I will grow out my beard, wear simple clothing, and speak with a plainer accent. No one expects to find a duke trimming rose bushes, Edmund. That is precisely why it will work." Edmund studied his friend for a long moment, searching for any sign that this was merely a passing mood that would fade by morning. But Alexander's jaw was set in the same determined way it had been since childhood, whenever he decided on a course of action that no one could talk him out of. "This is a dangerous game you are proposing," Edmund said finally. "If she discovers the truth before you are ready to reveal it, you risk humiliating her in front of the entire county. And if your mother finds out you deceived your own bride during wedding preparations, she may never forgive either of us." "I am aware of the risks," Alexander's voice softened. "But I would rather know the truth now, even if it costs me some discomfort, than discover it after we are bound together for the rest of our lives. Elinor deserves a husband who trusts her completely, and I cannot offer that trust honestly until I understand who she truly is." Edmund exhaled slowly, recognizing defeat when he saw it. "Very well, I will arrange everything quietly. But you must promise me one thing, Alexander." "Name it." "If you discover something that breaks your heart, you will not let pride keep you from doing what is right for both of you." Alexander nodded, though he could not fully imagine what such a discovery might feel like. Part of him still hoped that Elinor would prove herself worthy of his trust, that the whispers among the servants were nothing more than idle gossip born of jealousy. But another part of him, the cautious part shaped by years of watching fortune hunters circle wealthy families like hawks, needed proof before he could quiet that fear entirely. 3 days later, the transformation was complete. Alexander stood before a mirror in a small cottage on the far edge of the estate grounds, hardly recognizing the man staring back at him. His usually neat hair had been left uncombed and slightly too long. A short beard covered his jaw, rougher than anything he had worn since his university days. His fine clothing had been replaced with a plain brown shirt, worn trousers, and sturdy work boots that had clearly seen years of honest labor before Edmund acquired them from a traveling merchant. "You look almost unrecognizable," Edmund said, standing in the doorway with a mixture of amusement and worry on his face. "Remember, your name is Tom. You came from a village 2 counties over seeking work after your previous employer passed away. Keep your answers simple. Do not mention anything a common gardener would not know." "I understand." Alexander flexed his hands, still soft from years of paperwork rather than physical labor. "Though I imagine my hands will tell a different story than my clothes for the first few days. Then work carefully, and claim you are recovering from an illness that kept you from heavy labor recently." Edmund handed him a small bag containing simple gardening tools. "The staff has been told a new man was hired through a recommendation from a distant cousin of the family. No one will question your presence, provided you act the part convincingly." Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the strange weight of his disguise settle over him. This was no longer merely an idea discussed in the safety of his study. This was real, and in a matter of hours he would walk among his own household as a stranger, watching his future wife with eyes she believed belonged to nobody of importance. "How will I know when to end this?" he asked. "When you have learned what you need to know," Edmund said simply, "or when your conscience demands it, whichever comes first." Alexander nodded, gathered the tools, and stepped out into the early morning air. The garden stretched before him, dew still clinging to the grass, the roses just beginning to open their petals to the rising sun. Somewhere within the grand house behind him, Elinor was likely still sleeping, unaware that the man she was set to marry had transformed himself into a stranger for her sake. He walked toward the garden shed, his heart pounding with a nervousness he had not felt in years. Dukes did not typically feel nervous. They commanded rooms, signed important documents, and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But standing here in borrowed boots, holding a set of pruning shears he barely knew how to use, Alexander felt more uncertain than he had on the day he inherited his title. He reminded himself why he had chosen this path. Marriage was not merely a business arrangement to him, despite what tradition and circumstance suggested it should be. He wanted a partner who would stand beside him through hardship as readily as through comfort, someone who valued his character above his coin. If Elinor possessed that kind of heart, he needed to witness it for himself, free from the performance that titles and wealth so often invited. and if she did not possess it, better to learn the truth now, while there was still time to choose a different path, however painful that choice might prove to be. The morning sun climbed higher as Alexander began his work in the garden, awkwardly at first, learning through trial and error how to properly trim the hedges without destroying them entirely. His hands blistered within the first hour, unfamiliar with tools that felt foreign despite their simplicity. Sweat gathered on his brow beneath the unfamiliar weight of his disguise, and more than once he considered abandoning the entire scheme and returning to his comfortable study. But then he heard footsteps approaching along the garden path, light and unhurried, accompanied by a voice humming a gentle tune he did not recognize. He looked up from his work and saw her for the first time as Tom the gardener rather than as Duke Alexander Whitmore. Lady Eleanor Ashford walked among the roses in a simple morning dress, her golden hair loosely pinned rather than styled for formal company. She had not yet noticed him, too absorbed in the beauty of the flowers around her, reaching out occasionally to touch a petal with obvious delight. There was something different about her in this unguarded moment, something softer and more genuine than the composed young woman he had met during their formal courtship visits. Alexander stood frozen for a moment, uncertain whether to announce his presence or continue working and hope she passed by without noticing him at all. Before he could decide, Eleanor's eyes drifted toward him, and recognition of a stranger's presence flickered across her features. "Oh," she said, startled but not alarmed. "I did not realize anyone was working out here this early." Alexander lowered his head slightly, remembering to adjust his voice to something plainer than his usual refined manner of speaking. "Beg your pardon, my lady. Didn't mean to disturb you. New groundskeeper, name's Tom. Started just this morning." "There is no need to apologize." Eleanor stepped closer, studying the rose bush he had been attempting to trim with evident curiosity rather than the dismissive glance he had half expected. "These roses have needed attention for weeks. The old gardener grew too tired toward the end to keep up with all the grounds." "So I've heard, my lady." Alexander kept his eyes respectfully lowered, though he found himself sneaking glances at her face, searching for any hint of the calculating nature the servant's gossip had suggested. He found none, only genuine interest and an easy warmth that seemed entirely natural rather than performed. "Do you enjoy this kind of work?" Eleanor asked, surprising him with the question. Most nobles he knew would never think to ask a servant such a thing, let alone wait patiently for an honest answer. Alexander hesitated, unprepared for genuine conversation so soon into his disguise. "I suppose I am still learning, my lady, but there is something peaceful about it, watching things grow with patience and care." Eleanor smiled, and it was the same warm, quick smile he remembered from their formal meetings, except now it felt entirely unguarded, offered freely to a man she believed held no importance whatsoever in the social order of the household. "I think that is a lovely way to see it," she said. "I have always admired gardens more than ballrooms, if I am honest. There is less pretending required among flowers." The comment struck Alexander with unexpected force. Less pretending required among flowers. Did she feel the same way about the world of nobility that he sometimes did, weary of performance and eager for something genuine? Or was this simply a clever remark designed to charm whoever happened to be listening, whether duke or gardener? He could not yet be certain. But as Eleanor continued down the garden path a few minutes later, glancing back once with another small smile before disappearing around a hedge, Alexander found himself more curious about her than he had been throughout their entire formal courtship. He returned to his work with renewed determination, blisters and uncertainty forgotten for the moment. Whatever the coming weeks revealed about Lady Eleanor Ashford's true character, he suspected the answer would not be simple, and he found himself surprisingly eager to discover it, one quiet garden conversation at a time. By midday, word had spread quietly through the kitchen staff about the new gardener, a pleasant enough young man named Tom who kept mostly to himself, but worked with surprising dedication for someone so clearly unfamiliar with the tools of his trade. The housekeeper, a stern but fair woman named Margaret Wells, watched him from the kitchen window as he struggled to properly tie back a climbing vine. "That one's hands are too soft for gardening work," she remarked to a young kitchen maid beside her. "Wonder where Edmund found him. Perhaps he is recovering from an illness, like they said," the maid replied, though Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly with the particular suspicion of someone who had managed a great household long enough to notice when things did not quite add up. Alexander, unaware of the housekeeper's careful observation, continued his work through the afternoon, growing more comfortable with the unfamiliar tasks as the hours passed. He learned to recognize which plants needed water and which needed shade, which weeds could be pulled easily, and which required careful digging around delicate roots. It was honest, tiring work, entirely different from the meetings and ledgers that filled his usual days, and despite the physical discomfort, he found himself appreciating the simplicity of it. As evening approached and the light began to soften into gold across the estate, Alexander gathered his tools and prepared to return to the small cottage where he would spend his nights during this strange experiment. His muscles ached in places he had forgotten existed, and his mind buzzed with everything he had observed throughout the day, particularly that single garden conversation with Alina that continued to replay itself in his thoughts. She had seemed genuine, kind even in a manner that felt natural rather than calculated. But one brief conversation on a single morning proved nothing definitively. Alexander reminded himself to remain patient, to observe carefully over the coming days and weeks before drawing any conclusions about her character. As he walked back toward his cottage, he passed near the main house and glimpsed Alina through a lit window, seated at a table with his mother. Both women bent over papers that likely detailed wedding arrangements. Alina laughed at something his mother said, the sound carrying faintly through the evening air, warm and unforced. Alexander paused, watching the scene for a moment longer than necessary. Whatever the truth about Alina's heart turned out to be, he realized with some discomfort that he genuinely wanted her to prove herself worthy of the trust he hoped to offer. He wanted to believe in her, more than he had expected to when this plan first formed in his mind 3 days earlier. He continued walking toward the cottage, uncertain whether that growing hope would protect him from disappointment or leave him more vulnerable to it than ever before. Either way, there was no turning back now. The disguise was in place, the household believed in Tom the gardener, and the coming weeks would reveal whatever truth Alina's unguarded moments held, for better or for worse. That night, lying on the simple cot in his borrowed cottage, Alexander found sleep slow to come. He thought of Alina's smile among the roses, her comment about pretending, the easy warmth in her laughter drifting through the lit window. He thought of the whispers that had started this entire scheme, the fear that had driven him to deceive the very woman he hoped to spend his life beside. Somewhere in the darkness between worry and hope, he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day in the garden, another chance to see Lady Alina Ashford as she truly was, far from the careful performances expected of a future duchess. The gardens, it seemed, might reveal more truth than any ballroom ever could. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that Alexander had not expected to find comforting. He woke before dawn, ate a simple breakfast of bread and cheese in his small cottage, and made his way to the gardens while the estate still slept. There was something honest about those early hours. The world washed in gray light before the sun fully claimed the sky, and he found himself looking forward to them more than he cared to admit. By the 4th morning, his hands had begun to toughen slightly, though blisters still stung beneath his gloves. He had learned the names of most of the flowers under his care, thanks in part to a small book on gardening that Edmund had quietly delivered to the cottage. He had also learned the rhythms of the household staff, who moved about their duties with the practiced efficiency of people who had worked together for years. Margaret Wells, the housekeeper, remained the person Alexander worried about most. She watched him with a careful, assessing gaze whenever their paths crossed, and though she said little, he sensed that she had not fully accepted the story of his sudden employment. He made a point of avoiding her whenever possible, keeping to the gardens and away from the kitchen where she held court over the rest of the staff. Alina, however, seemed to seek him out more often than pure coincidence could explain. On the fourth day, she appeared again near the rose garden shortly after breakfast, this time carrying a small book tucked beneath her arm. She settled onto a stone bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree, close enough to where Alexander worked that conversation felt natural rather than forced. "You are here early again," she observed, opening her book but not yet beginning to read. "The work goes easier before the sun grows too warm, my lady." Alexander kept his attention on the hedge before him, trimming carefully, mindful of maintaining his disguise even in small gestures. "Didn't expect to see you out here so soon either. I find it difficult to sleep lately." Alina's voice carried a note of honesty that surprised him. "There is a great deal to think about with the wedding approaching." Alexander paused his work, curiosity overtaking caution for a moment. "If you don't mind me asking, my lady, what troubles you most about it?" He expected her to deflect the question, to offer some polished response about excitement or nerves, the kind of answer expected from a young woman in her position. Instead, Alina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her book absently. "I worry that my husband will never truly know me," she said finally. "Everyone sees the Lady Alina who curtsies correctly and speaks the right words at dinner parties. Very few people have ever asked what I think or what I want, beyond what is expected of someone in my position." Alexander's chest tightened at her words, guilt mixing uncomfortably with the growing warmth he felt toward her honesty. Here she was, confiding genuine fears to a man she believed to be nothing more than a hired gardener, while the man she would soon marry stood before her in disguise, still uncertain whether to trust her completely. "Perhaps he will surprise you, my lady," Alexander offered carefully. "Perhaps he wants to know the real you, same as anyone would." Alina looked up at him then, something thoughtful passing across her expression. "You speak rather wisely for a gardener, Tom." Alexander felt his pulse quicken with alarm, worried he had revealed too much of his true manner of speaking. "My mother always said I listened more than most, my lady." "Perhaps that's where the wisdom comes from, if there's any to be found in me at all." She smiled at that, accepting his explanation without further question, and returned to her book. Alexander resumed his work, his mind racing with everything she had shared. There was nothing calculating in her words, nothing that suggested a young woman scheming to secure a wealthy match. Instead, he heard genuine loneliness, a fear of being valued only for her position rather than her true self, a fear remarkably similar to his own. Over the following days, their conversations continued, growing gradually more comfortable. Alina began bringing a small basket of bread for the garden birds each morning, always pausing to share a few words with Alexander while she scattered crumbs along the path. She asked about his supposed village, and he found himself inventing details carefully, drawing from memories of tenant villages he had visited throughout his life as Duke, careful never to reveal too much specific knowledge that a common gardener would not possess. He learned that Alina's family had once been quite wealthy, until a series of poor investments by her late father had left them struggling to maintain their estate. He learned that her mother pressured her constantly about the importance of this marriage, reminding her daily of the family's dependence on the match succeeding. He learned that Alina had a younger brother, barely 12 years old, whose education and future depended heavily on the family regaining financial stability. "Sometimes I feel as though I am not marrying for love or even for myself," Alina confessed one afternoon, sitting on the garden bench while Alexander worked nearby. "I am marrying to save my family from ruin. Is that a terrible thing to admit?" Alexander's hands stilled on the hedge he had been trimming. This was the confession he had feared hearing, the confirmation of the whispers that had started this entire disguise in the first place. And yet, hearing it spoken aloud by Alina herself, in her own honest voice, it did not sound like the calculating admission of a fortune hunter. It sounded like the weary confession of a young woman carrying a burden far too heavy for her years. "I don't think it's terrible, my lady," he said carefully. "Seems to me like you're trying to protect the people you love. That's not the same as only caring about coin." Eleanor's eyes glistened slightly, though she blinked the emotion away before it could fall. "You are kind to say so, Tom, though I sometimes wonder if the Duke will see it the same way, or if he will simply believe I agreed to marry him for his money and title alone." Alexander's heart ached with the weight of his deception in that moment. He wanted desperately to reveal himself, to tell her that he understood completely, that her honesty had already begun changing his perception of their entire arrangement. But he held his tongue, reminding himself that the test was not yet complete, that words alone did not prove character the way actions eventually would. "Perhaps you should tell him how you feel," Alexander suggested instead. "Perhaps he deserves to know the truth of your heart, same as you deserve to know his." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps you are right, though it is easier to speak honestly with a gardener than with a duke, I think. There is less at stake in a conversation among the roses." Her words lingered with Alexander long after she had returned to the house that afternoon. Less at stake in a conversation among the roses. He understood now why she found it easier to speak freely with Tom the gardener than with Alexander the Duke. The weight of his title, the formality of their arranged courtship, had prevented the kind of honest exchange that flourished naturally in this simpler setting. He began to wonder whether the entire premise of noble courtship, with its careful performances and calculated words, was designed in a way that made genuine connection nearly impossible. Perhaps Eleanor was not hiding a calculating heart behind pleasant manners. Perhaps she was simply trapped, like him, within a system that valued appearance over authenticity. But Alexander reminded himself that observation alone, however encouraging, was not sufficient proof. Words spoken freely to a gardener still cost Eleanor nothing in terms of social standing or financial security. If she believed Tom held no influence over her future, her kindness toward him, while genuine, did not yet demonstrate what mattered most. How she treated people when doing so came at some personal cost or risk to herself. That evening, Alexander met with Edmund in the privacy of the cottage, updating his friend on everything he had observed and learned. "She sounds like a young woman under a great deal of pressure," Edmund observed, listening carefully to Alexander's account. "Her honesty with you speaks well of her character, certainly, but you are right to want more than words as evidence." "I need to see how she acts when there is something at stake," Alexander said. "Not merely how she speaks when comfort costs her nothing." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the direction of his friend's thoughts. "You are considering the plan we discussed before you began this disguise, the false accusation." Alexander's jaw tightened at the thought. The idea had seemed reasonable in the abstract, back when Eleanor remained a stranger whose character he could not yet judge. Now, having spent days learning about her fears and her family's struggles, the idea of orchestrating a fake crisis felt considerably more uncomfortable. "I do not enjoy the thought of causing her distress," Alexander admitted. "But I see no other way to witness genuine character under pressure. Anyone can be kind when kindness costs nothing. The true test comes when kindness requires sacrifice." "Then we shall proceed carefully," Edmund said. "But Alexander, consider this. If she fails this test, you will have caused her needless distress for information you might have gathered through more time and patience. And if she passes, you will still have deceived her in a manner she may find difficult to forgive, regardless of your good intentions." Alexander understood the risk clearly, yet felt no closer to abandoning his plan. Too much uncertainty remained, too many unanswered questions about Eleanor's true nature beneath her genuine-seeming kindness. He needed more than pleasant garden conversations to feel confident in the marriage he was about to enter, a marriage that would shape the rest of both their lives. "We proceed within the week," Alexander decided. "I want a few more days to be certain of the timing, to make the situation believable enough that no one, especially Eleanor, suspects it is anything other than genuine trouble." Edmund agreed reluctantly, and the two men spent the following hour discussing the details of the plan, refining the story that would soon test Eleanor's character in ways that mere conversation never could. Alexander felt the weight of the decision settling over him as they talked, aware that whatever happened next would either confirm his growing hope for their marriage or shatter it entirely. Over the next several days, Alexander continued his work in the gardens, his conversations with Elinor growing warmer and more comfortable with each passing morning. She began telling him small jokes, laughing easily at his sometimes clumsy attempts at gardening humor, and he found himself genuinely enjoying her company in a way that had nothing to do with testing her character, and everything to do with simply appreciating her presence. It troubled him, this growing fondness, because it complicated the careful detachment he had intended to maintain throughout this experiment. He had meant to observe Elinor as a scientist might observe a specimen, gathering evidence dispassionately before drawing conclusions. Instead, he found himself looking forward to her morning visits with an eagerness that had little to do with gathering proof of her character and everything to do with simply wanting to see her smile. One morning, as she scattered crumbs for the garden birds while he trimmed a nearby hedge, Elinor asked him a question that caught him entirely off guard. "Do you have someone waiting for you, Tom? A sweetheart back in your village, perhaps?" Alexander's hand stilled momentarily before he forced himself to continue working, careful to keep his expression neutral despite the sudden warmth rising in his chest. "No, my lady, no one waiting for me." "That surprises me," Elinor said, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "You seem the sort of man who would make someone very happy." The compliment, offered so simply and without any apparent calculation, struck Alexander harder than he expected. He thought of all the young women he had met throughout his life as Duke, women who complimented his title, his wealth, his position in society, but rarely his character or his simple kindness. Elinor's words, offered to a man she believed held nothing of value beyond his willingness to work hard and speak honestly, felt more genuine than any compliment he had received in years. "You flatter me, my lady," he managed to say, "though I wonder if the Duke you're set to marry might disagree with such generous words about a common gardener." Elinor laughed softly at that, a warm sound that seemed to echo through the quiet garden. "I imagine the Duke has never spent enough time with any gardener to form an opinion at all. That is rather the trouble with nobility, I think. We surround ourselves with people we never truly see." Her words lingered with Alexander throughout the remainder of the day, a gentle accusation he could not entirely dismiss. Had he truly seen the people who worked his estate before this experiment began, or had he moved through his own gardens and hallways treating servants as background figures rather than individuals with their own thoughts, dreams, and struggles? The question troubled him more than he expected, adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Alexander made his way back to the cottage, his mind heavy with everything he had witnessed and learned throughout the preceding week. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, Edmund would set the false accusation into motion, and Alexander would finally learn the truth of Elinor's character under genuine pressure. Part of him dreaded the outcome, whatever it might prove to be. If Elinor abandoned her kindness the moment it required actual sacrifice, he would face the painful task of ending an engagement that had already begun to feel more meaningful than he had anticipated. And if she proved her loyalty genuine, he would face the equally daunting task of revealing his deception, hoping she could forgive the elaborate lie he had constructed around their entire courtship. Either way, there was no path forward that avoided difficulty entirely. Alexander settled onto his cot that night, staring up at the simple wooden ceiling of the cottage, and allowed himself to hope, however cautiously, that the coming days would confirm what his growing feelings already suspected. That behind the careful manners and practiced grace of Lady Elinor Ashford lived a heart capable of genuine loyalty, kindness, and love, regardless of what fortune or misfortune life presented to her. The garden had already taught him more about her character than months of formal courtship ever could. But the true test, the one that would determine everything, still waited just beyond the horizon of tomorrow. A visitor arrived at the estate on a bright afternoon nearly 2 weeks into Alexander's disguise, and his arrival changed the quiet rhythm of the household in ways no one, least of all Alexander, had anticipated. Lord Harwick Sinclair, a distant cousin of the Whitmore family, with a reputation for charm and considerably less fortune than his manners suggested, arrived unannounced, claiming he wished to offer his congratulations on the upcoming wedding in person. Alexander, watching from a distance near the garden wall, as a fine carriage rolled up the long drive, felt an immediate uneasiness settle over him. He knew Harwick well enough to recognize that the man rarely did anything without a purpose, and congratulations offered so far in advance of the actual wedding day seemed an unlikely reason for such an unexpected visit. That evening, from his cottage window, Alexander watched candlelight flicker in the windows of the main house, imagining the dinner conversation taking place without him. Edmund visited later that night, his expression grave as he relayed what he had overheard among the household staff. "Harwick has been asking questions," Edmund said quietly, keeping his voice low despite the privacy of the cottage. "About the estate's finances, about the timeline of the wedding, and curiously enough, about your whereabouts these past 2 weeks." Alexander's stomach tightened. "Does he suspect the disguise?" "I do not believe so, not yet, but he seems intent on discovering why you have been absent so frequently during preparations that would normally demand your presence." Edmund's frown deepened. "There is something else you should know. Harwick has been paying particular attention to Lady Alina throughout dinner, complimenting her, seeking her opinion on matters, behaving in a manner more suited to courtship than distant cousinly politeness." A sharp, unfamiliar feeling coursed through Alexander at these words, something he recognized reluctantly as jealousy, though he had no right to feel possessive over a woman he had not yet honestly revealed himself to. Still, the thought of Harwick, with his practiced charm and questionable motives, turning his attention toward Alina left Alexander deeply unsettled. "Harwick stands to inherit a considerable sum if my marriage to Alina falls apart before the ceremony," Alexander said slowly, working through the implications aloud. "My grandfather's will include a clause naming him as the next heir should I remain unmarried past my 30th birthday, which falls only 2 months after the planned wedding date." Edmund's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "You believe he might be here to sabotage the match?" "I believe it is worth considering," Alexander said grimly. "Harwick has always resented his position as a distant relation with limited prospects. If he saw an opportunity to prevent this marriage, whether by seducing Alina's affections away from me or by some other scheme entirely, I would not put it past him to attempt it." The following days brought increasing tension to the estate as Harwick extended his visit indefinitely, citing vague excuses about enjoying the countryside and wishing to know his soon-to-be cousin better before the wedding. Alexander, still bound by his disguise, could do nothing but watch from the gardens as Harwick spent increasing amounts of time in Alina's company, walking with her through the grounds, joining her for afternoon tea, offering compliments that grew bolder with each passing day. Alina, for her part, seemed to treat Harwick's attention with polite reserve rather than genuine interest, though Alexander found himself unable to fully trust his own judgment on the matter, colored as it was by his growing feelings for her. He needed to know for certain whether her politeness toward Harwick masked genuine attraction, or simply reflected the manners expected of a well-raised young woman toward a guest in her future husband's household. His opportunity to learn more came on a warm afternoon when Alina sought him out in the garden, her expression troubled in a way he had not seen before. "Tom, may I ask your opinion on something?" she said, settling onto the familiar stone bench while Alexander paused his work. "Of course, my lady." "Lord Harwick has been rather attentive during his visit," she said carefully, choosing her words with obvious deliberation. "I confess I find it somewhat uncomfortable, given that I am engaged to marry his cousin, yet I do not wish to be rude to a guest in the household." Relief washed through Alexander at her words, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "What troubles you about his attention, if I may ask?" "He speaks often of how different my life might be, married to a man with fewer responsibilities and more time to devote to companionship." Alina's brow furrowed. "He suggests, in subtle ways, that the Duke's frequent absences these past weeks reflect a lack of genuine interest in our marriage. He implies that a man who truly cared would not leave his bride to plan an entire wedding largely alone. Alexander felt a fresh wave of guilt at these words, recognizing the painful truth buried within Harwick's manipulative suggestions. His disguise, however well-intentioned, had indeed left Elinor to navigate wedding preparations without his presence, and Harwick had clearly noticed this absence and sought to exploit it for his own purposes. "What do you make of his suggestions, my lady?" Alexander asked carefully, genuinely curious about her answer despite the risk involved in asking. Elinor considered the question for a long moment before responding. "I do not fully understand the Duke's absences, I admit, but I do not believe Lord Harwick's version of events either. There is something insincere about his kindness, something that feels more like strategy than genuine concern for my happiness." "What makes you say that, if you don't mind sharing?" "He never asks what I actually want," Elinor said simply. "He tells me what my life could be, what I deserve, what I am missing, but he never once asks what I think or feel about any of it. It reminds me of every other conversation I have had with men seeking to secure my favor for their own benefit." She paused, glancing toward Alexander with something like fondness in her expression. "You, however, always ask what I think, even about small matters like which flowers to plant along the garden wall. It is a small thing, perhaps, but it means more to me than Lord Harwick's grand compliments ever could." Alexander's heart swelled with an emotion he could no longer easily deny, a growing certainty that Elinor's character ran deeper and truer than the whispers that had started this entire elaborate scheme. Yet even as hope grew within him, he reminded himself that Harwick's presence introduced genuine danger to his plan, danger that extended beyond simple observation and into the realm of active sabotage. That evening, Edmund brought further troubling news. Harwick has been overheard suggesting to Lady Elinor's mother that the Duke's absences might indicate reluctance about the marriage itself. He has planted doubt about whether you truly intend to follow through with the wedding at all. Alexander's frustration mounted at hearing this. He seeks to create enough uncertainty that the engagement collapses under its own doubts, without ever appearing directly responsible for its failure. "It seems likely," Edmund agreed. "And with each passing day that you remain in disguise, his suggestions grow more convincing to those who do not know the truth." The situation demanded careful navigation, Alexander realized. He could not simply abandon his disguise now, not when he remained so close to gathering the proof he sought about Elinor's character. Yet he also could not allow Harwick's manipulations to poison the engagement before he had the chance to reveal himself and explain his true intentions. "I need to accelerate the plan," Alexander decided. "We proceed with the false accusation sooner than intended, before Harwick's schemes cause irreparable damage to the engagement." Edmund's expression remained troubled. "Are you certain this is wise, given everything happening with Harwick's presence complicating matters further?" "I am certain of very little at this point," Alexander admitted honestly. "But I know that waiting longer only gives Harwick more opportunity to sow discord. We proceed within 2 days." The plan, as Edmund had originally helped design it, involved a fabricated accusation of theft against Tom the gardener, staged convincingly enough that the household would believe it genuine. A small but valuable garden ornament, an antique sundial that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, would be reported missing, with circumstantial evidence pointing toward the newly hired gardener as the likely culprit. Edmund, in his role as steward, would announce Tom's dismissal without pay, framing the situation as an unfortunate but necessary response to apparent theft. The scheme carried real risk, Alexander understood. If handled carelessly, it could damage his reputation among the staff even after his true identity was revealed, and it required Edmund to lie convincingly to people who trusted him, a burden Alexander felt guilty asking his loyal friend to carry. But he saw no better path toward learning Elinor's true character before circumstances, complicated further by Harwick's presence, forced decisions that could not easily be undone. 2 days later, the household buzzed with quiet gossip about the missing sundial. Margaret Wells, ever vigilant about matters within her domain, had discovered its absence from the garden pedestal where it normally sat and immediately reported the matter to Edmund. Within hours, suspicion had settled upon Tom, the newest and least established member of the household staff, a convenient target given his unfamiliar background and recent arrival. Alexander, playing his part with a heavy heart, allowed himself to appear appropriately shocked and distressed when Edmund confronted him formally in the garden, loudly enough that several members of the household staff, gathered nearby under the pretense of other duties, could overhear the exchange. "I have never touched that sundial," Alexander protested, his voice carrying genuine distress, though not for the reasons his audience assumed. "I would never steal from this household. I need this position, sir." "Please believe me." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Edmund replied, his own tone carefully rehearsed to sound stern and regretful rather than performed. "You were seen near the garden pedestal shortly before the sundial's disappearance was noticed, and no other explanation has presented itself. I am sorry, Tom, but I must let you go, effective immediately, and without the wages owed for your work this month." The gathered staff murmured among themselves, some expressing sympathy, others nodding as though the accusation confirmed suspicions they had harbored about the mysterious new gardener all along. Alexander felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, an uncomfortable reminder of how quickly reputation could crumble under the weight of accusation, however false. He lowered his head, playing his part of wounded innocence, and made no further protest as Edmund instructed him to gather his few belongings and leave the cottage by the following morning. As he turned to walk away, he caught sight of Alina standing near the garden entrance, her expression a mixture of shock and something that looked remarkably like outrage. She had witnessed the entire exchange. Alexander's heart pounded as he continued walking toward the cottage, uncertain what Alina's reaction meant for the days ahead, uncertain whether her outrage stemmed from disbelief at the accusation itself, or simply discomfort at witnessing an unpleasant scene. He would not have long to wait for his answer, as he heard quick footsteps approaching from behind, accompanied by Alina's voice calling his false name with unmistakable urgency. "Tom, wait, please." He turned slowly, finding Alina several steps behind him, her expression now clearly showing distress and determination in equal measure. "I do not believe you stole that sundial," she said firmly, without any hesitation or doubt in her voice. "I have watched you work in these gardens for 2 weeks. You have shown nothing but honesty and care in everything you do. This accusation makes no sense." Alexander's throat tightened with emotion he had not fully prepared himself to feel. "The evidence seems clear enough to Edmund and the rest of the staff, my lady. Perhaps I should simply accept the judgment and move on quietly." "Perhaps the evidence is wrong," Alina insisted, stepping closer. "I intend to speak with Edmund myself to ask him to reconsider before making such a drastic decision. Dismissing you without wages based on nothing more than your presence near the garden shortly before something went missing seems entirely unfair." Alexander watched her, his heart aching with a complicated mixture of guilt over the deception and genuine hope at witnessing her fierce defense of a man she believed held no power or status to reward her loyalty. This was precisely the kind of proof he had hoped to find, evidence that Alina's kindness extended beyond convenient moments into genuine conviction, even when defending an accused thief carried social risk and no personal benefit whatsoever. "You are very kind, my lady," Alexander said softly, meaning the words more sincerely than she could possibly understand. "But I would not want you to trouble yourself on my behalf. Your position here is precarious enough without adding controversy so close to your wedding." Alina's expression grew even more determined at his words. "Kindness should not depend on convenience, Tom. If I only extend fairness when it costs me nothing, then it is not truly kindness at all, merely performance. I intend to speak with Edmund regardless of what you say." She turned and walked purposefully back toward the main house, leaving Alexander standing alone on the garden path, overwhelmed by emotions he had not fully anticipated feeling. Whatever remained of his doubt about Aliner's character had begun crumbling entirely in the face of her genuine, unhesitating conviction. Yet the scheme was not yet complete, and he knew that whatever Aliner did next would provide the final, undeniable proof he had sought since first conceiving this entire elaborate plan. As evening fell over the estate, Alexander returned to his cottage, uncertain what the coming hours would bring, but increasingly certain that Aliner Ashford possessed a heart far more genuine and loyal than the whispers of gossiping servants had ever suggested. Whatever Harwick's schemes, whatever doubts had driven Alexander toward this elaborate deception in the first place, he found himself now facing a different kind of fear entirely. The fear that he had wronged a good woman through unnecessary deception, and that revealing the truth might cost him her trust regardless of how the test itself concluded. The night stretched long and sleepless before him, filled with anticipation for whatever tomorrow would reveal. Aliner found Edmund in his small office near the estate's entrance hall shortly after leaving Alexander in the garden. She knocked firmly on the open door, and Edmund looked up from his papers with an expression of practiced surprise, well rehearsed for this very moment. "Lady Aliner," he said, rising from his chair. "How may I assist you?" "I wish to discuss the matter of the gardener you dismissed this afternoon," Aliner said, closing the door behind her for privacy. "I do not believe he stole the sundial, Edmund, and I would like you to reconsider your decision." Edmund maintained his composed expression, though internally he felt the weight of the deception pressing uncomfortably against his conscience. "I understand your concern, my lady, but the evidence, while circumstantial, was sufficient to raise serious doubt about his honesty. I cannot in good conscience retain a member of staff under such suspicion." "What evidence precisely?" Aliner pressed, her tone remaining respectful but firm. "You mentioned he was seen near the garden pedestal. Surely many people pass through that area throughout the day, given it sits along the main path between the house and the gardens." Edmund hesitated, momentarily uncertain how to respond convincingly without revealing more than the scheme called for. "The timing seemed suspicious, my lady, given his recent arrival and unfamiliar background." "Being recently hired does not make a man a thief," Aliner countered. "I have spoken with Tom on numerous occasions these past 2 weeks. He has shown nothing but diligence and honesty in his work. Dismissing him without proper investigation, and without paying wages he has rightfully earned, seems both unfair and potentially damaging to this household's reputation, should word spread that servants here are treated so carelessly." Her final point struck Edmund as particularly clever, appealing not merely to sympathy, but to practical concerns about the estate standing among its staff and the surrounding community. He found himself genuinely impressed by her reasoning, separate entirely from his obligation to maintain the ruse. "I will consider your words carefully, my lady," Edmund said, choosing to leave the conversation somewhat open-ended, as the plan called for continued distress before eventual resolution. "Though I cannot promise an immediate reversal of my decision." Aliner's jaw set with determination. "Then allow me to offer a solution. I have some personal savings, modest though they may be, set aside from an allowance my father left me before his passing. I would like to offer these funds to cover Tom's owed wages, at minimum, until this matter can be properly investigated and resolved." Edmund stared at her, genuinely startled now, the surprise no longer merely performed. "My lady, that is a remarkably generous offer, but surely unnecessary. This is not your responsibility to resolve." "Perhaps not my responsibility in the strictest sense," Aliner said. "But I cannot in good conscience watch a man dismissed unfairly, left without wages he earned through honest labor, simply because circumstances make it convenient to blame him. If no one else will stand up for what seems right, then I shall do so myself, regardless of whether it is technically my place." Edmund found himself momentarily at a loss for words, the weight of Aliner's genuine conviction settling over him, in ways the original plan had not anticipated. He had expected, perhaps, a mild protest, or a request for reconsideration, not an offer of personal financial sacrifice on behalf of a man Alina believed to be nothing more than a common gardener with no connection to her own life or future. "I will speak with the Duke's mother about this matter," Edmund said finally, needing time to consider how this development affected the remainder of the plan. "Perhaps a more thorough investigation is warranted before any final decisions are made." Alina nodded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "Thank you, Edmund. I only ask that fairness be given proper consideration, regardless of Tom's position within this household." She left the office with the same quiet determination that had brought her there, and Edmund sat back down heavily in his chair, genuinely shaken by what had just transpired. He had witnessed something in Alina that afternoon that no amount of careful observation in the garden could have revealed so clearly. A willingness to sacrifice her own resources and risk her own social standing for the sake of someone she believed held no power to benefit her in return. He made his way to the cottage that evening to relay everything to Alexander, finding his friend pacing restlessly before the small fireplace, clearly anxious about how the day's events had unfolded. "She offered her own savings," Edmund said without preamble, watching Alexander's expression carefully as the words registered. "Her personal allowance, meant to be hers alone, offered freely to cover wages for a man she believes to be nothing more than a hired gardener accused of theft." Alexander stood frozen for a long moment, processing the full weight of what Edmund had just told him. This was not merely kindness offered at no cost, not merely warm conversation exchanged during pleasant garden mornings. This was genuine sacrifice, financial and social, offered without hesitation for the sake of someone Alina believed held no ability to reciprocate or reward her generosity in any meaningful way. "I need to end this," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot continue deceiving her, not after learning what she is truly willing to do for someone she believes to be powerless and without status. It is cruel to continue this charade any longer than absolutely necessary." "I agree the test has proven itself sufficiently," Edmund said, "though I would caution you to consider carefully how and when you reveal the truth. Given Harwick's continued presence and his apparent efforts to sow doubt about your commitment to this marriage, timing matters a great deal." Alexander nodded slowly, forcing himself to think through the complications despite the emotional turmoil churning within him. Harwick remained a genuine complication, his motives clearly self-serving and potentially dangerous to the stability of the entire engagement. Revealing his disguise now, in the midst of Harwick's ongoing manipulations, risked further chaos if not handled with sufficient care. "I need one more day," Alexander decided. "Tomorrow, I will find a way to reveal myself to Alina privately, away from the prying eyes of the household staff, and away from Harwick's manipulative presence. She deserves an explanation offered with dignity and privacy, not a public spectacle that further complicates an already delicate situation." Edmund agreed, though he cautioned Alexander once more about the risks involved in further delay. "Harwick grows bolder each day he remains here. I overheard him this evening suggesting to Lady Alina's mother that perhaps the wedding should be postponed, given what he characterized as troubling signs about the Duke's commitment to the marriage." The mention of postponement sent fresh urgency coursing through Alexander. If Alina's mother, already anxious about her family's financial situation, began seriously considering delay or cancellation based on Harwick's manipulative suggestions, the entire engagement could unravel before Alexander had the chance to properly explain his actions and reveal the truth of his growing affection for Alina. "Then we cannot afford to wait even one more full day," Alexander said, revising his plan on the spot. "Arrange for Alina to walk in the garden tomorrow morning, as she typically does. I will reveal myself then, before Harwick has further opportunity to poison the situation with his lies." Edmund nodded and departed to make the necessary arrangements, leaving Alexander alone in the cottage with his thoughts churning restlessly through the night ahead. He replayed every conversation he had shared with Alina over the past 2 weeks, searching for any lingering doubt about her character, any sign that her kindness had been calculated rather than genuine. He found none. Every moment, every word, every gesture had reflected a young woman of true integrity, trapped within circumstances not entirely of her own making, doing her best to navigate a difficult situation with as much honesty and grace as possible. He thought, too, of Harwick's growing boldness, his manipulative suggestions designed to erode trust between Alexander and Alina before the marriage could even take place. Whatever satisfaction Alexander felt at having finally learned the truth of Alina's character was tempered by genuine concern about what Harwick might attempt next, particularly once he learned that his schemes had failed to achieve their intended purpose. As the night wore on, Alexander found himself drafting and redrafting the words he would use to explain his deception to Alina, searching for language that might soften the inevitable shock and hurt she would feel upon learning the truth. He knew no combination of words could fully erase the sting of discovering that the gardener she had confided in, defended, and offered her own savings to protect, was in fact the very duke she was set to marry, the man whose absence during wedding preparations had caused her such distress in the first place. Yet he also held onto a fragile hope that once the initial shock passed, Alina might come to understand his reasons, might recognize that his elaborate deception, however flawed in its execution, had ultimately been born from a genuine desire to know her heart before binding his life to hers. Whether that hope would prove justified remained to be seen, but Alexander resolved to face tomorrow's conversation with as much honesty and humility as he could summon, regardless of how Alina chose to respond. Sleep came slowly that night, interrupted repeatedly by anxious thoughts about the conversation ahead and lingering worry about Harwick's continued presence and uncertain intentions. When dawn finally broke over the estate, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Alexander rose from his cot feeling both exhausted and strangely resolved, ready to finally set aside the disguise that had served its purpose and face whatever consequences awaited him in its place. He dressed in his simple gardening clothes one final time, gathering his tools with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at composure. Today, the truth would finally emerge, and whatever happened next would determine not only the future of his marriage, but the very foundation of trust upon which that marriage would need to be built. Walking toward the garden in the pale morning light, Alexander felt the weight of 2 weeks of deception pressing down upon him, alongside a growing, fragile hope that the truth, however difficult to share, might ultimately strengthen rather than destroy the connection he had come to value more than he ever expected when this elaborate scheme first began. Alina arrived in the garden earlier than usual that morning, drawn by a restless energy she could not quite explain, though the previous day's confrontation with Edmund lingered heavily in her thoughts. She had barely slept, her mind turning over the injustice of Tom's dismissal and wondering whether her intervention had made any difference at all. She found herself hoping, with an intensity that surprised her, that she would see him one final time before he left the estate for good. She found him standing near the rose bushes, though something about his posture seemed different this morning, less like the practiced humility of a hired gardener and more like a man bracing himself for a difficult conversation. "Tom," she said, approaching slowly, "I did not expect to find you here still. Has Edmund reconsidered?" Alexander turned to face her, and something in his expression, some quality of nervous intensity she had not seen before, gave her sudden pause. "Lady Alina, there is something I must tell you, something important, and I fear it will be difficult for you to hear." Alina's heart began to race, uncertain what confession he intended to offer. "You may speak freely with me, Tom, whatever it is." Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself for the conversation he had rehearsed countless times throughout the sleepless night. "My name is not Tom," he began. "I did not come to this estate as a common gardener seeking employment. I am Alexander Whitmore. I am the duke you are set to marry." For a long moment, Alina simply stared at him, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief, as though her mind struggled to reconcile the familiar face before her with the impossible words he had just spoken. "That is not possible," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I have met the Duke. I have spoken with him during our formal courtship visits. You are not him. I grew a beard, dressed in simple clothing, and changed my manner of speaking, Alexander continued gently, understanding her disbelief but pressing forward with the truth regardless. I disguised myself deliberately so that you would not recognize me. I am truly sorry for the deception, Elinor. I never meant to cause you pain. Elinor took a step backward, her hand rising to cover her mouth as the full weight of his words began settling over her. Why? She said, her voice shaking now with a mixture of emotions Alexander could not fully untangle from where he stood. Why would you do such a thing? Why would you deceive me this way? Alexander felt the full force of her hurt and confusion pressing against him, and he knew that whatever explanation he offered would need to be honest and complete, however uncomfortable the truth might prove to be. I heard rumors among the household staff before our engagement, suggestions that you might be marrying me only to save your family from financial ruin, without any genuine affection or respect for me as a person. I could not bear the thought of marrying a woman who saw me only as a solution to her family's troubles. So I devised this plan to learn the truth of your character before our wedding day arrived. So you disguised yourself as a servant, Elinor said slowly, working through the implications with visible effort, and allowed me to confide in you, to share my private fears and hopes, all while secretly judging whether I was worthy of your trust. The accusation, fair as it was, struck Alexander deeply. When you describe it that way, I understand how deeply wrong my actions must seem to you. I am not proud of the deception, Elinor, but I promise you, everything I witnessed these past 2 weeks has only deepened my respect and admiration for you. Your kindness, your honesty, your willingness to defend a man you believed held no power to reward you, all of it revealed a character far more genuine than I ever dared hope to find. You tested me, Elinor said, her voice growing sharper now, hurt giving way to something closer to anger. You orchestrated a false accusation of theft, allowed me to believe an innocent man was being treated unfairly, allowed me to offer my own savings to protect someone I believed to be a stranger, all so that you could evaluate whether I was worthy of marrying you. Do you understand how that feels, Alexander? To learn that every private conversation, every moment of genuine connection I believed we shared, was in fact an elaborate examination I did not even know I was taking. Alexander had no adequate defense against her words, because everything she said was entirely true. He had deceived her, had used her genuine vulnerability and honesty against her in service of his own uncertainty about their arranged marriage. Whatever noble intentions had originally driven his plan, the execution had caused genuine harm to a woman who deserved better than manipulation, however well-meaning the motivation behind it. You are right to be angry with me, Alexander said quietly. I cannot defend the deception itself, only explain the fear that drove me to it. I was afraid of marrying someone who did not truly know me, who valued my title above my character. I never considered fully how my actions might harm you in the process of seeking that reassurance. I am deeply sorry, Elinor, and I understand if you cannot easily forgive this deception. Elinor was quiet for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself as though bracing against the cold morning air, though Alexander suspected the gesture had more to do with emotional shock than physical temperature. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though uncertainty still colored every word. I need time to think about everything you have told me, she said. This is a great deal to absorb all at once. I do not know how to reconcile the man I have come to trust and care for these past 2 weeks with the Duke I agreed to marry. A man I barely know beyond formal, careful conversations arranged by our families. I understand, Alexander said, though the words carried genuine anguish, fearful that this conversation might mark the end of whatever connection they had built together in the garden. Take whatever time you need, Elinor. I will not press you for an answer before you are ready to give one. Before Elinor could respond further, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the tense moment between them. Both turned to see Lord Harwick striding purposefully along the garden path, his expression carrying a satisfaction that immediately put Alexander on guard. "How touching," Harwick said, his voice dripping with false pleasantness as he approached. "The Duke finally reveals himself to his bride, though I must say, cousin, this is a rather unusual courtship strategy, even for you." "How long have you known?" Alexander demanded, his suspicion about Harwick's motives sharpening into genuine alarm. Harwick's smile widened, cold and calculating. "I suspected something unusual the moment I noticed your convenient absences aligned rather precisely with the gardener's sudden appearance. A few careful questions to the staff confirmed my suspicions readily enough. I have known for several days now, cousin, though I confess I found it rather entertaining watching you play at being a common laborer." "And you said nothing," Alexander said, understanding immediately the manipulative purpose behind Harwick's silence. "You allowed the situation to continue, hoping it would create exactly this kind of confrontation, exactly this kind of doubt between myself and Alinar." "I merely allowed events to unfold naturally," Harwick said with feigned innocence, though his eyes carried undisguised satisfaction at the visible distress on Alinar's face. "Though I must say, Lady Alinar, learning that your betrothed has spent 2 weeks deceiving you rather thoroughly does raise legitimate questions about his character and his intentions toward your future together. Perhaps this marriage requires more careful reconsideration than either of your families originally anticipated." Alinar's eyes narrowed as she studied Harwick, something clicking into place behind her troubled expression. "You knew, and you said nothing, allowing me to continue confiding in Tom, allowing this deception to continue longer than necessary. Why would you do such a thing, unless you had some purpose of your own to serve?" Harwick's confident expression faltered slightly under her direct questioning, and Alexander watched with growing interest as Alinar's sharp intellect began working through the situation, piecing together motivations that Harwick had clearly hoped would remain hidden. "I simply thought it best not to interfere in matters between family members," Harwick said, though his explanation sounded considerably less convincing than his earlier confident pronouncements. "You stand to inherit Alexander's title and fortune should this marriage fail to take place before his 30th birthday," Alinar said slowly, the pieces evidently falling into place with growing clarity. "You have spent this entire visit attempting to create doubt about the Duke's commitment to our marriage, suggesting to my mother that perhaps the wedding should be postponed or reconsidered entirely. This was never about family courtesy or cousinly concern, was it, Lord Harwick? This was about protecting your own inheritance by sabotaging a marriage that threatens your financial interests." Harwick's composure cracked visibly now, his earlier confident smile replaced by something closer to alarm, as he realized his careful scheme had been uncovered so thoroughly and so quickly. "I do not know what you mean to suggest, Lady Alinar, but I assure you my concerns for your welfare have been entirely genuine." "I do not believe you," Alinar said firmly, her voice steady despite everything else weighing on her in this difficult morning. "And I think it best that you conclude your visit to this estate promptly, Lord Harwick, before your continued presence causes further unnecessary complications for a family matter that does not concern you." Alexander watched with a mixture of amazement and renewed affection as Alinar, despite her own confusion and hurt at his deception, demonstrated remarkable clarity and strength in confronting Harwick's manipulative scheme. This was not the behavior of a woman overwhelmed by circumstance, but rather someone capable of thinking clearly and acting decisively even amid personal turmoil, exactly the kind of character Alexander had hoped, against all odds, to find in his future wife. Harwick, recognizing that his position had grown untenable, offered a stiff, insincere apology before turning and striding back toward the main house, presumably to arrange his hasty departure from the estate before further scrutiny could uncover the full extent of his manipulative intentions. Once he had disappeared from view, Alinar turned back to Alexander, her expression still carrying the weight of everything that had transpired within the span of a single difficult morning. "I still need time to process everything that has happened today," she said quietly. Your deception, however understandable your fears may have been, hurt me deeply, Alexander. I do not know yet how I feel about our marriage or about you, given everything I have learned this morning. I understand completely, Alexander said, though disappointment and worry churned within him at the uncertainty in her words. I will give you whatever space and time you require, Alina. I only hope that eventually, you might find it within yourself to forgive my deception, even if you cannot immediately trust me the way you did before learning the truth. Alina nodded slowly, then turned and walked back toward the main house, leaving Alexander alone once more in the garden that had witnessed the beginning, and, quite possibly, the ending of whatever connection they had built together over the preceding 2 weeks. He stood among the roses for a long while after she disappeared from view, uncertain whether the coming days would bring reconciliation or heartbreak, but grateful, at least, that Harwick's manipulative scheme had been exposed before it could cause further damage to an already complicated situation. Whatever happened next, Alexander understood that the truth, however painful, had finally been spoken between them, and only time would reveal whether that truth could serve as the foundation for genuine trust, or whether his deception had caused a wound too deep for Alina to overcome. The days following the revelation passed slowly and uncomfortably for everyone involved. Alina kept largely to her chambers, emerging only for necessary meals and brief, strained conversations with Alexander's mother about wedding arrangements that now felt uncertain given the tension hanging over the entire household. Alexander, no longer bound by his disguise, resumed his duties as Duke, though he found himself unable to focus properly on estate matters, his mind constantly returning to the pained expression on Alina's face when she had learned the truth of his deception. He did not press her for conversation, honoring his promise to give her whatever space she required, though the waiting proved more difficult than he had anticipated. Each day that passed without word from Alina felt like confirmation of his deepest fear, that his elaborate scheme, however well-intentioned, had permanently damaged whatever trust they might have built together during those 2 weeks in the garden. Edmund, sensing his friend's growing despair, attempted to offer what comfort he could during their evening conversations. She has not called off the engagement, he pointed out one evening, finding Alexander once again staring into the fireplace with troubled distraction. That alone suggests she has not entirely given up on the possibility of reconciliation. Perhaps she simply has not yet decided how to proceed, Alexander replied, though he appreciated his friend's attempt at reassurance. Her family's financial situation remains precarious, Edmund. She may feel trapped by circumstances into continuing this engagement regardless of her personal feelings about my deception, and that thought troubles me nearly as much as the possibility of losing her entirely. Edmund had no easy answer for this concern, recognizing the genuine complexity of Alina's position. If she chose to proceed with the marriage despite her hurt feelings, motivated primarily by her family's need for financial stability, Alexander would find himself in precisely the situation his original disguise had been designed to avoid, married to a woman whose commitment stemmed from necessity rather than genuine affection. Meanwhile, within her private chambers, Alina wrestled with her own complicated emotions, turning the events of the preceding weeks over in her mind repeatedly, searching for clarity amid the confusion and hurt that Alexander's deception had caused. She thought of every conversation shared in the garden, every moment of genuine connection she had believed existed between herself and a simple gardener named Tom. Learning that Tom had been Alexander all along cast those memories in an entirely different light, forcing her to reconsider everything she thought she understood about their budding relationship. Yet as the days passed, and her initial shock and anger gradually softened into more measured reflection, Alina found herself unable to dismiss entirely the genuine warmth she had felt during those garden conversations. The kindness Tom had shown her, the patient way he had listened to her fears and frustrations, the gentle encouragement he had offered when she confessed her anxieties about the marriage, none of that had felt performed or calculated. If anything, Alexander's willingness to endure physical discomfort, blistered hands and unfamiliar labor, simply to learn the truth of her character, suggested a man who took their marriage far more seriously than she had initially believed possible. Still, the manner of his deception troubled her deeply. He had orchestrated a false accusation against himself, allowing her to believe genuine injustice was taking place, manipulating her natural sense of fairness for the purpose of testing her character. Even understanding his underlying fears about marrying someone motivated purely by financial necessity, Alina struggled to fully forgive the calculated nature of his scheme. She sought out her mother one afternoon, needing someone to confide in about the turmoil churning within her, though she chose her words carefully, uncertain how much detail to share about the full scope of Alexander's deception. "You seem troubled, my dear," her mother observed, setting aside the needlework she had been occupied with when Alina entered the sitting room. "Has something happened between you and the Duke?" Alina hesitated, then decided honesty, at least partial honesty, would serve her better than continued silence. "He deceived me, mother, in ways I am still struggling to fully understand or forgive. I do not know whether I can trust him completely, given what he has done." Her mother's expression grew concerned, though Alina noticed a flicker of something else beneath the concern, perhaps worry about what such doubt might mean for their family's precarious financial situation. What sort of deception, Alina? Surely nothing that would justify calling off the engagement entirely, given everything our family depends upon this marriage proceeding successfully. The comment, however gently offered, struck Alina with uncomfortable clarity, reminding her precisely of the pressure she had confided to Tom weeks earlier in the garden, the weight of her family's expectations pressing down upon her regardless of her own genuine feelings about the marriage. "I understand our family's circumstances, mother," Alina said carefully. "But I also believe I deserve to enter this marriage with genuine trust in my husband, not merely resigned acceptance driven by financial necessity." Her mother's expression softened slightly, though worry remained evident beneath her attempted composure. "Of course, my dear. I only meant to remind you of the stakes involved, not to dismiss your legitimate concerns. Perhaps you should speak with the Duke directly, rather than continuing to avoid the matter through prolonged silence. Understanding often comes easier through honest conversation than through solitary rumination." Alina recognized the wisdom in her mother's advice, however uncomfortable the prospect of another difficult conversation with Alexander felt. She had spent days now replaying the revelation scene in the garden, analyzing every word he had spoken, searching for clarity that solitary reflection alone could not fully provide. Perhaps her mother was right that genuine understanding required direct conversation rather than continued isolation and avoidance. That evening, Alina sent a brief note to Alexander, requesting a private conversation the following morning, not in the garden this time, but in the estate's formal library, a space that felt more appropriate for the serious discussion they needed to have. Alexander received the note with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety, uncertain what Alina intended to say but grateful, at least, that she had chosen to speak with him directly rather than allowing the situation to fester indefinitely through continued silence. He spent much of that night preparing himself mentally for whatever conversation awaited him, determined to offer complete honesty and genuine humility, regardless of how difficult Alina's questions might prove to be. The following morning, Alina arrived at the library precisely at the appointed hour, finding Alexander already waiting, his posture betraying the same nervous tension she herself felt as she entered the room and closed the door behind her for privacy. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Alina began, settling into a chair across from where Alexander stood near the fireplace. "I have spent the past several days trying to understand my own feelings about everything that happened, and I find I still have many questions I need answered before I can decide how to proceed with our engagement." "Ask me anything," Alexander said, meaning the words completely. "I owe you complete honesty, Alina, regardless of how uncomfortable my answers might prove to be." Alina took a steadying breath before continuing. "When you listened to my fears about our marriage, about my family's financial troubles and my worry that you might never truly know me beyond formal courtship visits. Were those conversations genuine to you? Or were you simply gathering evidence to judge my character, treating my most private confessions as data points in some elaborate experiment? Alexander considered his answer carefully, understanding the importance of complete honesty in this moment. Both, if I am being entirely truthful, he said. I began this disguise intending primarily to observe and judge your character, yes. But as our conversations continued, Alina, I found myself genuinely moved by your honesty, genuinely invested in understanding your fears and hopes as a person, separate entirely from whatever test I had originally designed. By the time the sundial scheme took place, I was no longer simply gathering evidence. I was terrified of losing something genuine that had grown between us during those garden mornings. Alina absorbed his answer thoughtfully, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, but finding only earnest vulnerability. Why did you not simply tell me your fears directly, rather than resorting to such an elaborate and painful deception? Could we not have had an honest conversation about your concerns regarding my motivations for this marriage? The question struck at the heart of Alexander's original miscalculation, and he answered with genuine regret in his voice. I feared that a direct question would only produce the answer you believed I wanted to hear, rather than the honest truth of your feelings. Noble courtship, as you yourself observed during one of our garden conversations, involves a great deal of pretending, careful words chosen to create favorable impressions rather than genuine understanding. I wanted to see your true character, unguarded and unperformed, and I mistakenly believed deception was the only path toward achieving that goal. There is irony in that reasoning, Alina said, a faint, humorless smile touching her lips. You deceived me in an attempt to discover whether I was being honest with you. Do you see how that logic might trouble someone, Alexander? I see it clearly now, Alexander admitted. I have had many sleepless nights to reflect on the flaws in my reasoning, Alina. I do not offer excuses for the pain my deception caused you, only genuine remorse and a promise that I will never again resort to such manipulation, regardless of my fears or uncertainties about our relationship. Alina was quiet for a long moment, studying him carefully as she weighed his words against everything she had experienced and felt over the preceding weeks. I want to believe you, she said finally, and truthfully, despite everything, I find that I miss the conversations we shared in the garden, even knowing now who you truly were during those exchanges. That confuses me greatly, Alexander. How can I miss conversations built upon deception? Perhaps because the deception concerned only my identity, not the genuine connection we built despite it, Alexander offered gently. Everything I said to you in that garden, every question I asked about your thoughts and feelings, every moment of comfort I offered when you confided your fears, all of that came from genuine affection and respect, Alina, not merely from calculated evaluation. The lie was my identity. Everything else between us was true. Alina considered this distinction carefully, and Alexander watched as something in her expression began to soften, though uncertainty remained clearly present beneath the gradual thawing of her earlier hurt and anger. I need to think further about everything you have said, she told him. But I no longer believe our engagement must end because of this. I simply need time to rebuild the trust your deception damaged, however genuine your underlying feelings may have been. Relief flooded through Alexander at these words, though he understood clearly that Alina's willingness to continue the engagement did not yet constitute full forgiveness or restored trust. Rebuilding what his deception had damaged would require patience, consistent honesty, and demonstrated reliability over time, not merely words spoken in a single difficult library conversation. Take whatever time you need, Alexander said sincerely. I will spend every day between now and our wedding, and every day beyond it, working to earn back the trust I damaged through my own foolish scheme. You deserve nothing less, Alina. She nodded slowly, rising from her chair to depart, though she paused at the library door and turned back to face him one final time. For what it is worth, Alexander, I do believe your fears about this marriage were not entirely unreasonable, even if your method of addressing them was deeply flawed. Perhaps we simply needed, from the very beginning, to have honest conversations rather than relying on the careful performances our family's expectations demanded of us. With that, she departed the library, leaving Alexander with a fragile but genuine sense of hope that their relationship, however damaged by his deception, might yet find a foundation sturdy enough to support the marriage and future they both still, despite everything, seemed to genuinely want to build together. In the weeks that followed their library conversation, Alexander made good on his promise to rebuild what his deception had damaged, approaching the task with the same patient dedication he had once applied to learning the unfamiliar craft of gardening. He no longer hid behind disguises or elaborate schemes, choosing instead to spend genuine time with Alina as himself, joining her for walks through the very gardens where their unlikely friendship had first taken root, this time without pretense standing between them. Their conversations, at first, carried a careful formality neither of them could entirely shake, both aware of the fragile trust they were attempting to rebuild after such a significant breach. Alina asked questions occasionally about his time as Tom, curious about which moments had been genuine and which had been calculated, and Alexander answered each question with complete honesty, understanding that transparency now mattered more than ever before. "Did you truly not know how to properly trim a hedge when you began?" Alina asked one afternoon, a hint of genuine amusement breaking through her lingering reserve as they walked past the rose bushes that had witnessed so much of their complicated history together. "I very nearly destroyed an entire section of hedge on my first day," Alexander admitted, grateful for the lighter tone their conversation had taken. "Edmund found a small book on gardening for me, and I studied it late into each night, desperate not to reveal my inexperience through some obvious mistake." Alina laughed at this, a genuine sound that Alexander had missed greatly during the tense weeks following his revelation. "I remember thinking you seemed unusually thoughtful for a common gardener, always pausing to consider your work carefully rather than simply proceeding with confident experience. I suppose that thoughtfulness came from genuine uncertainty rather than natural caution." "A great deal of my behavior during those weeks came from uncertainty," Alexander said honestly. "Uncertainty about the gardening itself, certainly, but also uncertainty about you, about our marriage, about whether I was making a terrible mistake by deceiving someone who deserved far better treatment from me." Their walks continued regularly over the following weeks, each conversation gradually rebuilding the comfortable ease that had once characterized their garden meetings, though now grounded in complete honesty rather than elaborate disguise. Alina found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely enjoying Alexander's company as himself, discovering that many of the qualities she had admired in Tom, his thoughtfulness, his genuine curiosity about her thoughts and feelings, his patient willingness to listen without judgment, belonged equally to the Duke she was set to marry. Yet complications from Harwick's earlier scheming had not entirely disappeared, even after his hasty departure from the estate following Alina's confrontation. Word had apparently spread, through channels neither Alexander nor Alina could fully trace, about the unusual circumstances surrounding their engagement, and whispers began circulating throughout the county about the Duke's elaborate deception of his own bride. Alina's mother approached her daughter with visible anxiety one evening, having heard troubling gossip during a visit to a neighboring estate. "People are saying the strangest things, Alina, that the Duke disguised himself for weeks, that he tested your loyalty through some elaborate scheme involving a false accusation. Surely these rumors cannot be entirely true." Alina considered how much to reveal to her mother, understanding that the full truth might cause further worry about the stability of an engagement her family depended upon so heavily. "There were some unusual circumstances, Mother," she said carefully. "But Alexander and I have discussed everything openly, and I believe we understand each other's intentions and feelings clearly now. Please do not worry yourself over gossip that likely exaggerates the truth of what actually occurred." Her mother remained visibly unconvinced, though she chose not to press further, perhaps recognizing that her daughter's calm reassurance, however incomplete, offered more comfort than continued anxious questioning would provide. Alina, for her part, found herself surprised by how naturally she had come to defend Alexander against the exaggerated gossip circulating about their engagement. A clear sign, she realized, that her feelings toward him had shifted considerably from the hurt and confusion that had dominated her thoughts in the immediate aftermath of his revelation. Harwick, meanwhile, had not entirely abandoned his scheming, despite his hasty departure from the estate. Edmund received word through a trusted contact that Harwick had been spreading his own version of events throughout certain social circles, painting Alexander as unstable and untrustworthy, hoping perhaps to convince Alina's family to reconsider the engagement even now, weeks after his manipulative presence had been exposed and dismissed. He seems determined to salvage his scheme through gossip and reputation damage, given that direct manipulation failed to achieve his intended results. Edmund reported to Alexander one evening, concern evident in his voice. I worry he may attempt something more drastic as the wedding date approaches, particularly if he senses his final opportunity to prevent the marriage slipping away entirely. Alexander's jaw tightened at this news, frustrated that Harwick's selfish ambitions continued threatening the fragile progress he and Alina had made toward rebuilding genuine trust between them. What more could he possibly attempt, Edmund? He has already been exposed as manipulative and self-serving in front of Alina herself. I do not know precisely, Edmund admitted, but men desperate to protect their financial interests sometimes act in ways that surprise even those who know them well. I would advise increased caution as the wedding approaches, particularly regarding any correspondence or visitors claiming connection to Harwick or sympathetic to his cause. Alexander took this warning seriously, though he chose not to burden Alina with additional worry about Harwick's continued scheming, hoping instead that increased vigilance from himself and Edmund would prove sufficient to protect their engagement from further sabotage as they moved closer toward their wedding day. Despite this lingering concern, the weeks continued to bring genuine progress in Alexander and Alina's relationship. Their conversations grew increasingly comfortable, filled with easy laughter and genuine curiosity about each other's thoughts and dreams, qualities that had characterized their garden meetings weeks earlier, now enriched by complete honesty rather than concealed identity. Alina began confiding in Alexander directly about her hopes for their future together, no longer needing the safety of anonymity to share her genuine thoughts and feelings. I would like our marriage to be a genuine partnership, she told him one afternoon, as they sat together in the same garden where their story had first begun. Not merely a formal arrangement where I manage the household, while you manage the estate's business affairs separately, but something built on genuine collaboration and honest communication between us. I want exactly the same thing, Alexander replied earnestly. And I promise you, Alina, that whatever mistakes I made during those weeks of deception, I have learned the value of honest, direct conversation far more thoroughly than I ever expected to. I will not repeat the error of assuming manipulation serves better than simple honesty ever could. Alina smiled at this, reaching out to take his hand in a gesture that felt entirely natural despite the complicated history that had brought them to this moment. I believe you, she said softly. And I find myself genuinely looking forward to our wedding day now, Alexander, in a way I did not expect to feel again after learning the truth of your deception. Her words carried enormous relief and joy for Alexander, confirmation that their relationship, despite its unusual and difficult beginning, had grown into something genuine and worth celebrating. Yet even as hope and happiness filled him during this tender moment, a small, persistent worry remained about Harwick's continued scheming and what final attempts he might make as their wedding day drew ever closer. That evening, as Alexander walked back toward the main house after another comfortable conversation with Alina, Edmund approached him with an expression of genuine urgency that immediately dispelled the peaceful contentment of the preceding hours. "Alexander, we have received troubling news," Edmund said, his voice low and serious. "Harwick has been seen in the village nearest our estate, speaking privately with several tradesmen who have contracts with Aliner's family regarding wedding preparations. I fear he may be attempting some final scheme to disrupt the ceremony itself, given that his earlier efforts to prevent the marriage through gossip and manipulation have failed to achieve his desired outcome." Alexander's contentment evaporated instantly, replaced by sharp, focused concern about what final desperate action his scheming cousin might attempt as their wedding day, now only 1 week away, drew closer with each passing hour. Whatever peace and progress he and Aliner had achieved together over the preceding weeks now faced its most significant test yet, one that would require both vigilance and careful preparation to navigate successfully. "We must discover exactly what Harwick intends," Alexander said firmly, his mind already working through possible precautions and countermeasures. "I will not allow his selfish ambitions to disrupt what Aliner and I have worked so hard to rebuild between us. Whatever scheme he has planned, we must uncover and address it before it can cause genuine harm to our wedding or to Aliner's safety and peace of mind." Edmund nodded gravely, understanding the seriousness of the situation clearly. "I will increase our watchfulness immediately and gather whatever information I can about Harwick's activities and intentions. We have 1 week before the wedding, Alexander. We must use that time wisely to ensure nothing threatens the ceremony or Aliner's well-being." As Alexander retired to his chambers that night, his earlier contentment now tempered by genuine concern about Harwick's uncertain intentions, he found himself reflecting on how far his relationship with Aliner had traveled since those first tentative garden conversations weeks earlier. They had overcome deception, hurt, and doubt to rebuild something genuine and valuable between them. He resolved that whatever final scheme Harwick attempted, it would not succeed in destroying what they had worked so hard and so honestly to achieve together. The remaining days before the wedding passed in a blur of careful watchfulness and mounting tension, as Edmund worked diligently to uncover the precise nature of Harwick's final scheme. His inquiries eventually revealed that Harwick had been attempting to convince one of the tradesmen supplying flowers for the ceremony to delay delivery deliberately, hoping to create enough chaos and embarrassment on the wedding day that Aliner's family might question whether proceeding with such disorganized celebrations reflected poorly on the match itself. "It seems a rather petty scheme, given everything else he has attempted," Alexander observed when Edmund reported his findings, though relief colored his voice at learning the plot involved nothing more dangerous than delayed flower deliveries. "Petty perhaps, but potentially embarrassing enough to cause genuine friction between families already anxious about wedding preparations," Edmund replied. "I have already spoken with the tradesman in question and secured his commitment to proceed with the original delivery schedule, regardless of whatever additional payment Harwick offered to convince him otherwise." Alexander nodded, grateful for his friend's careful diligence in protecting the wedding from further disruption. Yet something about the relatively minor nature of this final scheme troubled him slightly, a nagging suspicion that Harwick, having failed so completely in his more direct manipulations, might attempt something bolder and more desperate as the wedding day itself approached. His suspicions proved justified on the morning of the wedding itself. Aliner had risen early, her chambers filled with the quiet bustle of preparation as her mother and several attendants helped her dress for the ceremony that would formally bind her future to Alexander's. Despite the lingering anxiety about Harwick's uncertain intentions, Aliner felt genuine excitement and happiness as she prepared for her wedding day, confident in the honest foundation she and Alexander had rebuilt together over the preceding weeks. That confidence wavered slightly when a servant arrived at her chambers with an urgent message, claiming that Alexander needed to speak with her privately before the ceremony began, regarding an important matter that could not wait until after the wedding. Aliner, though puzzled by the unusual request given wedding day traditions, typically discouraged the bride and groom from meeting before the ceremony itself, nonetheless followed the servant toward a private sitting room near the estate's east wing, trusting that Alexander would not make such an unusual request without genuine cause. She entered the room to find not Alexander waiting for her, but Harwick, his expression carrying a desperate intensity that immediately put her on guard. "Lord Harwick," she said carefully, glancing back toward the door she had just entered, uncertain whether to remain or immediately depart given his history of manipulative behavior. "I was told the Duke wished to speak with me." "A necessary deception, I am afraid," Harwick said, moving to position himself between Alina and the door, a gesture that sent immediate alarm coursing through her despite her attempts to remain outwardly composed. "I needed to speak with you privately, Lady Alina, before you make the irreversible mistake of marrying my cousin." "I have no interest in hearing further manipulation from you, Lord Harwick," Alina said firmly, though her heart raced with genuine unease at finding herself alone with a man whose scheming had already caused such significant disruption to her engagement. "Please step aside and allow me to return to my preparations." "You do not understand the full truth of what you are marrying into," Harwick pressed, his voice growing increasingly urgent as he apparently sensed his final opportunity slipping away. "Alexander's deception of you was not an isolated incident born of temporary uncertainty. He has always been a man who values control above genuine partnership, who manipulates circumstances to serve his own purposes regardless of the cost to others. What guarantee do you have that he will not deceive you again, once the wedding has secured your commitment beyond any easy reversal?" Alina felt a flicker of genuine doubt at these words, memories of her own earlier hurt and confusion resurfacing briefly before she steadied herself, recalling everything she had learned about Alexander's character both during his disguise and throughout their weeks of honest rebuilding afterward. "I have spoken extensively with Alexander about his deception," she said firmly. "He has demonstrated genuine remorse and has worked diligently to rebuild honest trust between us. I do not believe your characterization of him reflects the man I have come to know, Lord Harwick, particularly given your own demonstrated willingness to manipulate circumstances for your personal benefit." Harwick's expression darkened at her steady refusal to accept his manipulative framing. "I see reasoning with you directly proves as difficult as it did before," he said, his tone shifting to something colder and more calculating. "Perhaps you require more concrete proof of Alexander's untrustworthy nature. I happen to have in my possession certain correspondence between Alexander and Edmund, discussing the details of your loyalty test in terms that suggest considerably less genuine affection and considerably more calculated evaluation than Alexander has led you to believe." He produced a folded letter from within his jacket, extending it toward Alina with an expression of triumphant satisfaction. Alina hesitated, uncertain whether to accept the document, wary of yet another manipulation designed to plant doubt at precisely the moment she needed clarity and confidence most. Before she could decide how to proceed, the door to the sitting room opened abruptly, and Alexander himself entered, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as he took in the scene before him. "Alina, what is happening here?" he demanded, moving quickly to stand beside her, putting himself protectively between her and his scheming cousin. "I received no message requesting your presence in this room." "Because I sent the message myself, claiming it came from you," Harwick admitted without shame, apparently recognizing that his scheme had already been exposed regardless of further concealment. "I merely wished to ensure Lady Alina possessed complete information before proceeding with a marriage that threatens my rightful inheritance." Alexander's expression hardened with genuine anger at his cousin's continued manipulative behavior, even on the very morning of his wedding. "You have caused enough damage already, Harwick. I will not allow you to continue interfering in my marriage through deceptive schemes and manufactured documents." "This letter is genuine," Harwick insisted, still holding the folded paper toward Alina. "Written in your own hand, cousin, discussing your plans to test Lady Alina's loyalty in terms that reveal your true calculating nature." Alexander's eyes widened slightly with recognition as he glanced at the letter Harwick held, apparently recalling correspondence he had indeed exchanged with Edmund during the early planning stages of his disguise. That letter, whatever its origin, reflects only my initial uncertainty before I came to know Alina's true character, he said steadily. It does not reflect the genuine affection and respect I hold for her now, feelings that have only deepened through our honest conversations these past weeks. Alina, watching this exchange unfold with careful attention, found herself surprisingly unmoved by Harwick's dramatic revelation. "I do not need to read that letter, Lord Harwick," she said calmly. "Alexander has already told me directly about his original uncertainty and his reasons for the disguise. Nothing written in early correspondence changes the honest conversations we have shared since then, or the genuine trust we have worked together to rebuild." Harwick's confident expression finally crumbled entirely at Alina's steady refusal to be manipulated by his scheme, whatever genuine documentation he might possess. "You are both fools," he spat, frustration overtaking his earlier calculated composure. "I offered you clear evidence of his true nature, and you choose blind faith over reason." "I choose trust built through honest effort over gossip and manufactured suspicion," Alina corrected firmly. "There is a considerable difference, Lord Harwick, though I do not expect someone motivated purely by self-interest to fully understand that distinction." Alexander, watching Alina defend their relationship with such calm conviction, felt profound gratitude and admiration for the woman he was about to marry, further confirmation, if any had still been needed, that his original fears about her character had been entirely unfounded. Whatever damage his deception had caused, Alina's genuine strength of character and clarity of judgment had allowed them to rebuild something far more valuable than the careful, guarded courtship that had preceded his disguise. "Edmund," Alexander called toward the open doorway, where his steward had apparently been waiting nearby, having followed Harwick's movements closely once his suspicious behavior that morning had been noticed by household staff. "Please see that Lord Harwick is escorted from this estate immediately, and ensure he does not return without explicit invitation. Whatever family connection we share, his continued presence here serves no purpose beyond causing unnecessary distress." Edmund entered the room promptly, flanked by 2 footmen who moved to escort Harwick from the premises despite his continued protests about unfair treatment and family loyalty. As they departed, Harwick's voice could be heard fading down the hallway, still insisting that Alexander and Alina would eventually regret dismissing his warnings so completely. Once the room had cleared and only Alexander and Alina remained, a moment of quiet settled between them, the earlier tension of Harwick's manipulative confrontation gradually giving way to something calmer and more grounded. "Are you well?" Alexander asked gently, studying Alina's expression for any lingering distress from the unsettling encounter. "I am well," Alina confirmed, offering him a small but genuine smile. "Though I confess I am relieved that particular confrontation has finally concluded. I trust we have seen the last of Lord Harwick's schemes now that his final attempt has failed so completely." "I believe we have," Alexander agreed. "Edmund will ensure he does not trouble us further, and I suspect Harwick himself recognizes that continued interference serves no purpose beyond damaging his own reputation further within our extended family and social circles." Alina nodded, then glanced toward the door through which she needed to return to her wedding preparations, the ceremony now drawing closer despite the unexpected interruption. "I should return to my chambers," she said. "My mother and attendants will wonder what has become of me, and I do not wish to delay our wedding any further than Harwick's interference has already caused." "Of course," Alexander said, though he found himself reluctant to part from her, even briefly, after everything that had just transpired between them. "I will see you soon, Alina, at the ceremony itself, where I intend to make promises to you that I fully mean to keep, without deception or hidden testing, for the remainder of our lives together." Alina's smile deepened at these words, genuine warmth evident in her expression as she reached out briefly to touch his hand before departing toward her chambers. "I look forward to it, Alexander, truly." As she disappeared down the hallway, Alexander remained standing in the sitting room for a moment longer, reflecting on everything that had transpired since he first conceived his elaborate and ultimately flawed scheme to test Alina's loyalty. The disguise, the false accusation, the painful revelation, Harwick's persistent manipulations, and now, finally, this successful defense against his cousin's last desperate attempt to prevent their marriage. Through all of it, Alina had proven herself again and again to possess exactly the genuine, steadfast character he had hoped, against considerable odds, to find in his future wife. The wedding ceremony proceeded that afternoon without further interruption. The chapel filled with family, friends, and household staff, gathered to witness the formal joining of Duke Alexander Whitmore and Lady Alina Ashford. As Alexander watched Alina walk down the aisle toward him, radiant in her wedding gown, and carrying herself with the same quiet confidence and grace that had first captured his attention during those unlikely garden conversations weeks earlier, he felt an overwhelming certainty that whatever challenges their unusual courtship had presented, they had emerged from it with something far stronger and more genuine than either of them could have found through conventional, careful courtship alone. When they exchanged their vows before the assembled witnesses, Alexander spoke his promises with complete sincerity, grateful beyond measure, that the woman standing beside him had proven willing to forgive his significant mistakes and rebuild trust through patient, honest effort. Alina, in turn, spoke her own vows with matching sincerity, her earlier doubts and hurt feelings now fully resolved into genuine confidence in the marriage and partnership they were formally beginning together. As the ceremony concluded, and the assembled guests offered their congratulations, Edmund approached the newly married couple with a knowing smile, recalling the anxious conversations that had first set this entire unlikely story into motion weeks earlier. "I believe congratulations are in order, your graces," he said, using Alina's new formal title for the first time with evident satisfaction. "Though I confess, watching this story unfold from its unusual beginning to this happy conclusion, I never doubted for a moment that genuine character, once truly revealed, would win out over every obstacle placed in its path." Alexander, looking at his new wife with genuine love and admiration, could not help but agree entirely with his old friend's assessment. Whatever mistakes had marked the beginning of their unusual courtship, the honest foundation they had ultimately built together promised a marriage far stronger and more genuine than either of them could have achieved through careful, guarded formality alone. The months that followed the wedding brought a settled happiness to the Whitmore, a state that Alexander had once feared he might never find in his marriage. Alina took to her new responsibilities as Duchess with the same thoughtful care she had shown throughout their unusual courtship, quickly earning the respect and genuine affection of the household staff, many of whom remembered fondly the weeks when their new Duchess had defended a humble gardener against unjust accusation, never suspecting the true identity hidden beneath his simple disguise. Margaret Wells, the sharp-eyed housekeeper who had never fully believed the story of Tom's sudden employment, took particular satisfaction in occasionally reminding the young Duchess of her early suspicions. "I always sensed something unusual about that gardener," she would say with a knowing smile whenever the topic arose during quiet moments in the kitchen. His hands were far too soft for honest labor, and his manner of speaking slipped into something considerably more refined whenever he grew distracted. Alina would laugh warmly at these observations, no longer troubled by memories of the deception that had once caused her such genuine pain. "Perhaps you should have shared your suspicions with me sooner, Margaret. It might have saved us both a great deal of unnecessary distress. And denied myself the pleasure of watching everything unfold naturally. Never, your grace. Some lessons are better learned through patient observation than hasty intervention." Alexander, for his part, found himself continually grateful for the honest foundation he and Alina had built together, particularly during the inevitable challenges and disagreements that arose as any genuine marriage naturally encountered. Where once he might have hesitated to share difficult truths, fearing conflict or disappointment, He now approached even uncomfortable conversations with Alina directly, remembering clearly the painful lesson his earlier deception had taught him about the true cost of manipulation, however well-intentioned. Alina, similarly, found herself increasingly confident in expressing her own thoughts and opinions on estate matters, no longer content to remain a quiet, decorative presence within their marriage. She took genuine interest in the management of household affairs, and eventually, at Alexander's genuine encouragement, began involving herself in broader estate business as well, offering perspectives and ideas that Alexander came to value as an essential part of their partnership, rather than a mere courtesy extended to a dutiful wife. Word of their unusual courtship story gradually spread throughout the county and beyond, evolving through countless retellings into something of a local legend, the tale of a duke who disguised himself to test his bride's character, only to discover a loyalty and integrity that exceeded even his highest hopes. Young couples throughout the region began citing the story as inspiration for their own courtships, and more than one anxious mother reminded her daughter of Lady Alina's example, whenever conversations turned toward the importance of genuine character over superficial appearances in matters of marriage. Harwick, meanwhile, found his own circumstances considerably diminished following his failed schemes against the marriage. Word of his manipulative behavior had spread widely enough throughout their social circles that his reputation suffered significant damage, and he eventually withdrew from the county entirely, seeking opportunities elsewhere where his history of scheming remained less widely known. Alexander felt no particular satisfaction in his cousin's diminished circumstances, understanding that Harwick's own choices and character flaws had ultimately created his difficulties, separate from any deliberate punishment Alexander himself might have wished to inflict. As the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Alexander found himself once again walking through the familiar rose garden where their entire unlikely story had begun, though this time Alina walked beside him as his wife, rather than as a stranger unknowingly confiding in a disguised duke. The roses had grown considerably since those early weeks of his clumsy gardening attempts, flourishing under the continued care of a properly trained gardener hired shortly after Alexander's true identity had been revealed. "Do you ever regret how our courtship began?" Alina asked him one quiet evening, as they walked together among the same flowers that had witnessed so much of their complicated shared history. Alexander considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to offer complete honesty even now, well beyond the point where such honesty had become an established habit between them. "I regret the pain my deception caused you," he said. "That regret will likely never fully fade, Alina, and I do not believe it should, given how genuinely you deserved better treatment during those early weeks. But I cannot fully regret the path that led us to this moment, to the genuine partnership and love we share now. Perhaps that makes me selfish, wanting the outcome while wishing the journey toward it had been less painful for you." Alina considered his answer thoughtfully, then reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his in the comfortable, familiar gesture that had become so natural between them over their year of marriage. "I understand that feeling," she admitted. "I would not wish to relive the hurt and confusion of those difficult weeks, yet I also cannot fully regret them, given everything we learned about each other and about ourselves through that difficult process. Perhaps some marriages require difficult beginnings to build truly lasting foundations. Ours certainly did." They continued their walk in comfortable silence for a while longer, both reflecting on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this peaceful moment together. The gardens around them, tended now by a proper gardener rather than a disguised duke learning through clumsy trial and error, bloomed with the same beauty that had first drawn Alina to seek quiet solitude among the roses more than a year earlier, unknowingly beginning a courtship unlike any other in the history of their county. Their marriage, built upon the unusual foundation of disguise and revelation, deception and forgiveness, ultimately grew into something far more genuine and enduring than either of them could have achieved through conventional courtship alone. Alexander had set out to learn whether Alina's heart held genuine loyalty beneath her graceful manners, and in the process of that difficult, imperfect test, he had discovered not merely proof of her character, but a partner whose strength, honesty, and capacity for both forgiveness and genuine love exceeded everything he had once hoped to find in a wife. Alina, in turn, had learned that the man she was to marry, despite his significant early mistakes, possessed a heart genuinely invested in understanding her beyond superficial performance, willing to endure discomfort and risk considerable consequence simply to know her truly before binding his life to hers. That knowledge, hard-won through difficult circumstances, gave their marriage a depth of trust and understanding that many couples, spared such difficult tests, never fully achieved. As twilight settled gently over the estate that evening, painting the sky in soft shades of purple and gold above the gardens where their story had first taken root, Alexander and Alina walked back toward the main house together, their hands still joined, their hearts fully at peace with the unlikely, imperfect, but ultimately genuine love that had grown between a duke disguised as a gardener and the woman whose loyalty, once tested, had proven stronger and truer than either of them had ever dared to hope.